What does it take to turn a father into a monster? A man who manipulates and controls his own flesh and blood until they can no longer recognize the world around them? Marcus Wesson didn't just break his family, he twisted their minds, turning them into puppets of his own dark design. This wasn't a sudden burst of violence. It was the product of years of calculated manipulation. But how did one man gain so much power over an entire family? And how did his control escalate into one of the most devastating true crime tragedies in history? Marcus Wesson was born in Fresno, California in the 1940s. His childhood appeared unremarkable on the surface. His father was a construction worker, his mother a nurse's aide. Yet, behind closed doors, his upbringing was anything but typical. Wesson's father was distant, his mother was emotionally unstable, and the home was filled with dysfunction. Marcus, a quiet and withdrawn child, spent much of his early life observing rather than participating. From a young age, Wesson learned that people could be manipulated. He watched his parents, especially his mother, control and emotionally manipulate others. This early exposure to power dynamics, emotional distance, and psychological control laid the foundation for his later tactics. But what was it in his childhood that transformed these early experiences into a desire to dominate others? The answer lies in the way he internalized power. Wesson learned that to survive in a chaotic world, control was the key to shaping his reality. As a teenager, Marcus began to test boundaries, not out of rebellious anger, but to see how far he could push without facing consequences. He skipped school, not because he hated it, but to see how much he could get away with. His parents noticed but didn't enforce any meaningful punishment. This pattern of inconsistent discipline sent a clear message to Marcus. There were no real consequences for his actions. Psychologists point out that children who experience inconsistent discipline often develop a sense of impunity. In Wesson's case, this created the perfect breeding ground for his growing manipulative tendencies. With each unpunished action, his confidence grew. He learned that people could be controlled, pushed into doing what he wanted, if he understood their weaknesses. Welcome to Secrets in the Shadows, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of the human mind, exploring the chilling stories that often go untold. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an unraveling mystery. If you find this story gripping, give it a like and share it, because the more people know, the more we can uncover together. But before we begin, a word of caution. This story contains disturbing details about psychological manipulation, abuse, and loss. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Wesson's childhood was far from ideal. His father, a hard-working but emotionally distant man, wasn't very involved in Marcus's life. His mother, emotionally unstable, often relied on her job as a nurse's aide to provide for the family, but she was far from nurturing. Marcus grew up in an environment where emotional neglect and isolation were the norms, leaving him to fend for himself mentally and emotionally. School was where Marcus began to withdraw even more. While other kids socialized and played together, Marcus kept to himself. He was a quiet, solitary figure who preferred to observe others rather than participate. Teachers often described him as shy and introverted, a child who seemed disconnected from his peers. But it wasn't just his quiet nature. It was his ability to quietly manipulate those around him without them realizing it. In school, Marcus didn't rebel openly or act out. Instead, he quietly tested the boundaries, learning how far he could push without facing consequences. It was this detachment, this emotional distance, that would become the foundation for his later manipulation tactics. Despite the outward normalcy, Marcus's family was not a happy one. The emotional coldness in the home left a lasting impact on Marcus, shaping his personality in ways that would later help him manipulate others. His father, although a provider, was not a figure of emotional support. His mother's unpredictable moods made the home feel unstable, and this left Marcus with little to turn to for guidance or affection. It was in this emotional void that Marcus began to develop his need for control. He observed how people, his parents, teachers, and even classmates, acted when they thought no one was watching. He realized early on that power came from manipulation and fear. And in this quiet household, Marcus began to learn how to manipulate his environment. Reports suggest his mother was a Seventh-day Adventist who preached about strict morality and the apocalypse. His father was abusive and alcoholic, later abandoning the family entirely. This abandonment and religious rigidity formed the foundation for Marcus's later obsession with control, punishment, and godlike authority. From a young age, Marcus displayed controlling behaviors. He dropped out of high school, refused stable work, and manipulated people around him. Psychological experts believe he exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder, grandiosity, lack of empathy, and the need for excessive admiration. Marcus first crossed paths with Elizabeth at a time when his controlling tendencies were beginning to take shape. But how did a seemingly innocent meeting lead to a relationship that would forever alter both of their lives? Elizabeth was a young woman looking for a sense of belonging and security when she first encountered Marcus Wesson. At the time, Wesson appeared to be just another man seeking companionship. His charm and confidence masked the dark intentions that lurked beneath. To those around him, Wesson may have seemed harmless, but Elizabeth was soon drawn into a world where manipulation and control would replace her own agency. They met at a time when Wesson had already started building his own twisted belief system, one that blended religious delusion and absolute authority. Elizabeth, however, didn't see the manipulation at first. She was swept into his charisma, and Wesson, who had learned the art of persuasion through years of emotional isolation and control, easily hooked her in. What started as a seemingly ordinary relationship soon took on a darker tone. Wesson began to subtly impose his beliefs on Elizabeth. He convinced her that he was more than just a man. He was a divine figure, chosen by God to lead his family into a new world. He spoke of salvation, but in his twisted mind, salvation meant complete submission to his control. Slowly, Elizabeth began to believe that his teachings were true. She was convinced that following him was not only her duty, but her salvation. It wasn't long before Wesson manipulated her into accepting a role that would keep her tied to him. She became one of his followers, someone who would be part of his world, which was built on fear, emotional isolation, and absolute devotion to him. Wesson began grooming his own children at a disturbingly young age. He married Elizabeth when she was just 15, a relationship that began even earlier. He went on to sexually abuse their daughters and nieces, some as young as 7. Over time, he fathered at least 18 children, several through incest. He created incestuous marriage ceremonies, where girls as young as 8 were told they were now spiritually wed to him. He enforced secrecy through fear, warning them that the outside world would take them away or punish them if they spoke. Examples of his control are chilling. The children were homeschooled with materials he wrote himself, which were mostly about him. They weren't allowed to speak to outsiders. They referred to him as Lord or Master. Wesson's charm was powerful, and it didn't take long for him to convince Elizabeth that he was the divine figure he claimed to be. He told her, "You were chosen for this. You are the one who must follow me, and only through me will you find salvation." Through his manipulation, Wesson made Elizabeth believe that everything he did was justified by divine authority. He told her that the world outside was evil, corrupt, and dangerous, and that the only way to survive was to follow him completely. One of his most manipulative tools was fear. He constantly told Elizabeth that the apocalypse was near, and only those who obeyed him would be saved. "If you leave me, you will be lost," he would say. This constant threat of destruction made her believe that leaving him was not an option. Following him was the only way to ensure her place in the new world he had promised. Wesson didn't just manipulate Elizabeth with his religious beliefs. He also used emotional control. In the beginning, he was charming, using his affection to reel her in. He showered her with attention, making her feel special and unique. He made her believe that he cared for her deeply, that he was her protector. However, this emotional control soon began to take a darker turn. Whenever Elizabeth didn't comply with his wishes or question his authority, Wesson would use guilt to make her feel responsible for his actions. "If you truly loved me," he would say, "you would follow me without hesitation. God chose you to be mine." Wesson's words didn't just target her actions, they targeted her self-worth. He convinced her that her obedience was tied to her love for him, and that any disobedience was a form of betrayal. This guilt became a powerful tool, making Elizabeth feel trapped in a cycle where any attempt to resist or leave was seen as an attack on everything she had been taught to believe. When Elizabeth didn't meet his expectations, Marcus Wesson would turn to one of his most powerful manipulation tools, the silent treatment. This wasn't just a brief moment of quiet. It was a calculated act of emotional withdrawal. Wesson would completely shut her out, refusing to speak to her, leaving her in silence and confusion. The emotional toll of the silent treatment was devastating. Elizabeth would be left wondering what she had done wrong, desperate to earn back his affection and approval. She came to fear his silence more than his anger, because it left her feeling invisible, as though she no longer mattered to him. His silence was a weapon, one that controlled her, broke her down emotionally, and forced her to do anything to gain back his favor. With every passing day, Marcus Wesson's hold on Elizabeth tightened. The emotional manipulation and silent treatment led her to the point where she could no longer see any way out. Wesson's control extended beyond religious beliefs. He controlled every aspect of her life, from the way she thought to the way she felt. Elizabeth was no longer an independent person. She had become a pawn in his twisted game. Wesson had completely manipulated her into believing that she could only find peace, salvation, and love by following him. She felt that disobeying him wasn't just a betrayal of him, it was a betrayal of God. The more Wesson isolated her from the outside world, the more he made her dependent on him for emotional validation. Slowly, Elizabeth's sense of self was erased, replaced by Wesson's twisted version of reality. Marcus Wesson's manipulation of Elizabeth was not just about religious control or emotional dominance. It was about erasing her identity and rebuilding it around his power. Through his charm, his use of guilt, and his devastating silent treatment, he turned her into someone who saw him as her God, someone who couldn't think or act without his approval. This story is a chilling reminder of how manipulation works. It doesn't always come with physical force. It can come with words, with promises, and with carefully crafted emotional control. And once a person is manipulated to this extent, they become trapped, unable to see their own worth or escape the grip of their abuser. Marcus Wesson's manipulation of Elizabeth to allow him to sleep with his nieces was a grotesque example of emotional and psychological control. He convinced her that it was part of a divine plan, telling her that their family's bloodline needed to be continued in a specific way and that this was part of God's will. Wesson used his influence to frame this abuse as something sacred, even claiming that it was necessary to fulfill some twisted mission. To make the situation seem less horrific, he instructed Elizabeth and the others that if anyone ever asked, they should say they were undergoing a treatment to get pregnant. This was his way of silencing any doubts or moral concerns, manipulating them into believing they were part of a larger, divinely inspired plan, when in reality, he was only exercising his power and control over them through lies and coercion. Marcus Wesson began to sexually abuse his daughters and even a young boy in the household, using his position of authority to manipulate and control them. He convinced his victims that these acts were part of their divine duty to him, framing them as something necessary to fulfill his twisted belief system. Wesson groomed them emotionally, making them feel that this abuse was not only acceptable, but required to please him and fulfill a supposed greater purpose. Over time, his victims, including the young boy, were psychologically manipulated into thinking these actions were normal and justified, with Wesson's power and influence creating a world where they were unable to see the truth of what was happening. The abuse was framed as part of a greater mission, making them believe that disobeying him would lead to dire consequences. As Marcus Wesson's control over his family grew stronger, they became more and more isolated from the world. He convinced them that the outside world was dangerous and that only he could protect them. Wesson made sure they had no connections with friends or family, making them believe that anyone outside of their home was evil or corrupt. His family became entirely dependent on him. For example, he would tell them, "The world will hurt you, but I am the only one who can keep you safe." He used emotional abuse, such as accusing them of not loving him when they showed signs of doubt, and sexual manipulation, telling them it was their divine duty to please him. He made them believe that any disobedience was not only wrong, but would result in punishment from God. By the time Wesson's control was fully established, his family had completely submitted to him. They no longer thought for themselves or had any sense of independence. Wesson's manipulation had erased their ability to see the truth. For example, when one of his daughters asked why she had to follow his commands, he would tell her, "God has chosen me to guide you. To question me is to question God." This constant reinforcement of his power led the family to believe that they had no choice but to follow his every word, and they could no longer recognize the abuse for what it truly was. But over time, Wesson took steps to completely cut off his family from the outside world. The first thing he did was control the information his family received. Wesson banned television, radio, and newspapers, telling them that outside influences would corrupt them. He decided which books they could read, mostly religious books with his own notes in them. Even family photos were limited, so they couldn't remember their extended family or their past lives. This kind of control is common in cults, where the leader makes it harder for anyone to question their version of the truth. Then, Wesson built physical barriers. He put extra locks on the doors and boarded up windows. The house was designed so that all bedrooms opened into a hallway he could watch. He even added a strong fence around the property to make it clear that the outside world was dangerous. Neighbors sometimes saw the children, but they disappeared as soon as someone got close. Wesson also made sure the children didn't socialize. One by one, he pulled them out of school, claiming he was protecting them from the world. He stopped them from talking to neighbors and made sure they gave the right answers if anyone asked about school. He even made the children follow strict routines where they had to ask for permission to do basic things like eating or sleeping. Birthdays and holidays were ignored or turned into religious events focused on Wesson. This routine made his family more dependent on him. Medical care was also denied. Wesson didn't allow doctor visits or vaccinations, choosing to treat sickness with prayer instead. When one daughter got very sick, he locked her in a closet instead of taking her to the doctor. This kept anyone from noticing the abuse, and it made his family believe that only he could help them. Financially, Wesson controlled everything. He made family members work under fake names and handed him their earnings. He even bought the house using fake identities, making them hard to find by the authorities. By the early 2000s, Wesson had created a world where he was the only authority. The children had no friends, no real education, and no medical records. Some didn't even remember their own birthdays or the names of relatives they hadn't seen in years. They were completely isolated, unable to imagine life beyond Wesson's control. With isolation fully in place, Wesson became the only source of truth, law, and guidance for the family. Fear and intimidation were the foundation of Marcus Wesson's control over his family. His tactics went beyond just punishing bad behavior. He created an atmosphere of constant fear where no one ever felt safe. Family members learned quickly that even the smallest mistake could cause a violent outburst. But Wesson's unpredictable anger made it impossible to know what might set him off. For example, he would get furious if a dish was left in the sink for too long, or if a chore wasn't done perfectly. His goal wasn't just to enforce rules, but to break down any resistance, making obedience feel like the only option. Wesson's violence was random and unpredictable. Sometimes he would go days or even weeks without getting angry, then suddenly explode over something small, like a misplaced item or an imperfect task. He used his fists, belts, or boards to punish them. For example, one time, Wesson got enraged when a child misplaced a book, and he beat them severely with a wooden board. This unpredictability kept everyone on edge, always anxious about when calm would turn into chaos. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. When punishment happens randomly, it causes constant anxiety. The family lived in fear, always trying to avoid his anger, but nothing guaranteed their safety. Wesson also used sleep deprivation to weaken his victims. He would wake the family up in the middle of the night for surprise Bible studies that lasted for hours. If anyone fell asleep, they were immediately punished. Example: one night, he woke them up at 2 a.m. to conduct a Bible study that lasted until sunrise. If any child appeared tired or dozed off, Wesson would beat them with a belt. This exhaustion made it harder for his victims to think clearly or challenge him. Over time, it wore them down mentally and made them more easily controlled. He used collective punishment to keep everyone in line. If one person made a mistake, the entire family suffered. Wesson might make them stand in silence for hours or withhold food until someone admitted to something they didn't do. Example: if one child failed to clean their room properly, Wesson would punish the whole family by making them stand in the yard for hours without food. This created tension between family members who began watching each other, fearful of making any mistake that could lead to punishment for everyone. The idea of resisting felt too dangerous to even consider. Many of Wesson's worst tactics were disguised as religious rituals. He would stage fake exorcisms, tying up children and shouting prayers to remove demons whenever they tried to act independently. Example: when one child questioned his authority, Wesson tied them to a chair, yelled prayers, and claimed that the child was possessed and needed to be cleansed. He made them confess to imagined sins, convincing them that normal thoughts were dangerous and evil. These ceremonies blurred the line between punishment and psychological torture, making his control feel spiritual. He also threatened to abandon them if they didn't obey. He told the family that if they disobeyed him, they would be cast out, which was terrifying for children who had never experienced life outside his control. Example: Wesson told his children that if they didn't follow his rules, they would be left on the streets alone, forcing them to stay in fear of being rejected. Sometimes he would disappear for days, leaving them anxious and unsure if he would return, only to punish them for imagined failures when he came back. Basic needs like food and bathroom access were also used as tools of intimidation. Wesson would sometimes deny them meals or bathroom use as punishment. Example: if a child failed to complete a task to his satisfaction, he would refuse to give them dinner, leaving them hungry and desperate. This stripped away their dignity and made it clear that every part of their life had to be approved by him. Over time, violence and fear became a normal part of their lives. Some children started to punish themselves, hoping to avoid his anger. Example: if a child accidentally made a mistake, they would hit themselves or apologize repeatedly, hoping that it would keep Wesson's wrath at bay. The fear was so deep that even when Wesson wasn't around, they acted like he was watching them, never sure if he had set traps or planted spies among them. By the time authorities began to notice, Wesson's family had been conditioned to see any outside help as a threat, not a rescue. The fear he created wasn't just about pain. It was about survival in a world where Wesson made all the rules. Example: when social workers visited, the children were taught to lie about their schooling, and they were terrified to speak the truth, fearing Wesson's violent reaction. This constant terror was just one part of his control. The most dangerous part was how he manipulated their very sense of reality. The events leading up to the Wesson family massacre happened gradually, with each step making the atmosphere inside the house more fearful and obedient. Marcus Wesson didn't change overnight. Instead, his control turned more violent over time as he became more desperate in response to outside pressure. One of the first signs of this change was when Wesson started arming himself. Neighbors sometimes heard gunshots from his backyard, where he practiced shooting, claiming it was for self-defense. Inside the house, he hid guns in places where only he could reach them, constantly reminding his family of the danger they faced if they didn't obey him. The weapons made his control feel even stronger, as they were always there, a threat looming over them. The abuse also got worse. Wesson started targeting younger family members, making them undergo inspections as part of his twisted idea of religious purity. These inspections became more frequent and invasive, with Wesson's behavior growing more extreme as he felt his control slipping away. The combination of sexual, physical, and psychological abuse left his family in constant fear, never knowing what would happen next or what new punishment would appear. Wesson's religious beliefs became more intense and strange. He started predicting the apocalypse, but when the dates came and went without anything happening, he just changed them. His sermons became more erratic, mixing scripture with personal complaints and warnings of disaster. He told his family that he was receiving instructions from angels, pushing them to prepare for a world-ending event. His growing instability made his family even more isolated from the outside world. Wesson's financial control over his family also increased. He forced them to work long hours, took all their money, and made them sign fake confessions of theft or disloyalty. He kept detailed records of these debts, using them to manipulate his family into staying dependent on him. They couldn't escape because they didn't have money or any way to support themselves. The violence became more ritualized. Instead of punishing individuals, Wesson started punishing everyone for the actions of one person. He would force the whole family to recite his teachings while beating them, turning these moments into public displays of his power. The unpredictability of the punishments made his family feel even more hopeless. In the months leading up to the massacre, Wesson began staging rehearsals for disaster. He made his family practice things like suicide drills, pretending to poison their food to test their loyalty. He held fake interrogations, making them lie convincingly to imaginary outsiders. These practices blurred the lines between preparing for something real and simply tormenting them, making his family obedient to any command, no matter how absurd. By early 2004, the family was completely isolated, with no options left. Their reality had been shaped entirely by Wesson. When authorities finally arrived at the house, it wasn't because of a sudden outburst. It was the result of a long, deliberate campaign of terror. By early 2004, Wesson's control began to unravel. Several of his older daughters had left and were demanding custody of their children, his grandchildren. This posed a direct threat to his control. He feared losing everything. Then came March 12th, 2004. A family argument escalated. Police were called as a custody battle turned volatile. When they arrived, Wesson stalled them outside, while something unspeakable happened inside. Minutes later, officers entered the home to discover a mass grave of children and young women piled in a back room. All were shot through the eye, execution style. Police found Wesson covered in blood, calm and detached. He later claimed that his daughters had made a pact to carry out the murders themselves rather than be taken from him. But every sign pointed to Wesson as the orchestrator. Wesson's trial began in 2005. He was charged with 9 counts of murder and 14 sex crimes. In court, he maintained his innocence and claimed the murders were a group suicide. Psychologists who examined him noted a complete lack of remorse, a grandiose sense of self, and a disturbing calmness. He fit the profile of a narcissistic and delusional sociopath. He believed he had done nothing wrong, that his actions were divinely justified. The prosecution argued that he had absolute control over the family and orchestrated the killings to prevent losing power. The jury agreed. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to death. Survivors of Wesson's cult were left with unimaginable trauma. Many struggled to re-enter society. Some spoke about the fear, the indoctrination, the abuse, but others remained emotionally tied to him. Professionals in psychology and cult studies began re-evaluating how someone could exert such control in plain sight. Wesson's case became a chilling example of how domestic cults can thrive behind closed doors. As of 2025, Marcus Wesson remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the 2004 Wesson family massacre. Initially sentenced to death in 2005, his execution was put on hold in 2019 when California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order halting all executions in the state. Despite this, Wesson remains on death row due to the ongoing suspension of executions. The house where the murders took place was demolished, and the tragedy continues to affect the Fresno community, with survivors and law enforcement reflecting on the long-lasting impact of Wesson's actions. Marcus Wesson wasn't simply a murderer. He was a god in his own mind, a manipulative, delusional man who built a kingdom of fear and control. His psychological descent into madness created a world where evil was normalized and the unthinkable became divine. His story forces us to ask, how does one man's broken mind twist love into violence and family into a cult? And how many more Marcus Wessons might be hiding behind closed doors, worshipped in silence until it's too late? Thank you for watching Secrets in the Shadows. What do you believe truly created the monster Marcus Wesson became? Was it his past or something darker within? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case powerful or eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us share the stories that must be told. Until next time, stay aware and stay safe.